Welcome everyone, my name is Andreas Walters, and this is our first Gen Con panel, designing and working with IP. So what this panel is looking to do is talk about our experiences in acquiring, working with, and working on various intellectual properties that are not our own. And this is sort of slanted towards IPs that are from bigger brands, but not limited to that. I am Andreas Walters. I am the quote host, or the self-proclaimed host of this panel, and I am from Metal Weave Games. I use he/him pronouns, and I am working on the Hyperlight Drifter tabletop RPG, which is based on the video game Hyperlight Drifter. Mari or Ben, feel free to go next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mari.
Sorry,
I'm Mari
I didn't
Tokuda.
pick one.
Yeah. She/her pronouns, and I have worked on a number of different IPs, from Nancy Drew to Dune. So,
Nancy Drew, that's awesome.
Yeah. So kind of a little bit of a variety in there.
Oh yeah,
A lot of variety. Cool.
Hi, I'm Ben Woerner. I use he/him pronouns, and I've been designing since 2013. I've worked on all sorts of projects. From like Warhammer 40k to 7th and Dune as well. Yeah, I'm only on a couple hours of sleep, so I'm trying to remember all the things I've worked on.
I worked on stuff, a lot of stuff,
Stuff and
NDAs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, do you have something else to say, Ben?
Nope, that's it.
Oh, okay. So, I guess to start off is, how did you, let's start with stories about, like, working on IP. How did you get to work on IP? I guess for myself, Hyperlight Drifter, so for me as a publisher and creator, I had to acquire the IP to work on. And so for me, that involved me doing essentially a cold call. I sent emails out to various IP holders, and companies to see if I could work on, create a game with their IP. I got lucky, and one of them replied, "Sure, let's do it." And that was Hyperlight Drifter. And after a year of negotiations, discussions, that ended up becoming a contract and becoming a real thing. I know cold calling is one of the ways of getting an IP, but there are more formal methods in terms of like using an agency or knowing the guy that owns it. That helps usually a lot. Like in all industries, knowing people goes a long way. And that's my story for Drifter. I drafted a simple email, got a response back. Now, Drifter wasn't the only property I emailed to try and get. I talked to people at Bungie, Blizzard. I've talked to Hollow Knight. I have a couple other IPs as well. Shovel Knight. There's a lot of knights. I like working on knights. But yeah, we'll see what comes of those in the future. But that was my experience in terms of like cold calling. I had a pitch deck. I didn't use the pitch deck for Hyperlight Drifter, surprisingly. And just emailing directly to people and IP holders. Mari was I was gonna call him Mari, but then she took a drink. What about your experiences? How have you gotten to end up working on IPs?
Mostly it's through either freelancing or employment. I've only been involved in one instance of acquiring an IP to work on, and that was in the producer who was working on it knew the IP holder. Mm-hmm. So like you said, knowing someone really helps. Mm-hmm. But mostly, yeah, I haven't had to do any of the negotiation myself. It's been through a client or through an employer.
Okay.
So cool. That makes it really easy.
And what about you, Ben?
Yeah, I've had pretty much the same experience. Most of my IP work has been, as a writer or a designer, not the person acquiring anything. Although I have sent out a couple requests in the past and no one's, been interested. I think everyone at some point in the game community has sent a letter to Nickelodeon about
sure.
Avatar. But Nickelodeon doesn't seem interested. Now that Netflix is involved, though, who knows?
Yeah. No, it's...
I have my Avatar: The Last Airbender role-playing game all done and ready to go at some point.
Oh my gosh.
It's a
I wrote
habit until it
it in
becomes
2000.
official.
Right, I wrote it in like 2012, so it's probably terrible, but
That's
the
awesome.
year before I started professionally doing it. But yeah, so most of my work has been as a designer, not as a producer or a acquirer.
Yeah, no, I figured this section would be a little light since most of the people have worked on IPs more than acquired them. And so I'm going to bring in some experience. So I used to work with... my brain is blanking. Ivan at Hunter's Books, who's worked with a bunch of IPs before, most recently Altered Carbon. And one of the ways they got their IP was through a IP acquisition company. And so that's, as well as knowing people, sometimes there are IPs that are just inaccessible unless you go through an organization that is specialized in IP acquisitions, especially when you're looking at larger companies. Especially, so for instance, if you're looking at animes or if you're looking at various anime, or you're looking at comic books, like there are a number of conglomerates, like Viz Media, Universal. There's a Sony. Sony owns a lot of stuff.
There's actually, this reminded me, there's even some like independent groups that have stuff. Like I was approached by the people who own the rights to Vampire Hunter D a number of years back, and they were looking to do RPG stuff. Nothing came of it. I don't think they've even done anything. I'm not sure, but they've been like had approached a number of people, and yeah, I think it was on their end about as far as like moving forward with anything. But yeah, exactly. There's all sorts of groups and conglomerates, like you were saying.
And my major, I'm just gonna keep blabbing about this for just a tiny bit longer because there's interesting stuff in the negotiation side of contracts. So when you pitch and get, when you pitch for a IP, one of the interesting things that I came up against in terms of like figuring out contracts is, one, what do you get from the IP holder? What are you allowed to use? How much review do they get? What kind of stuff do they give you? Like,
right.
What kind of assets? So, like, I had to specifically ask for, like, game assets for Hyperlight to say, like, can I give these to artists? Or who owns the assets that you create for the game? Are they shared? Right. Who do they own it? Do you own it? What can you do with it? So, like, speaking on Hyperlight again, like, I'm not allowed to make a video game with the assets that we create. He's not allowed to make a tabletop game with the assets I've created. So we sort of have like our mutual bounds.
Right.
And then from there, obviously royalties, payments, and exit and renewal. Obviously, a very important thing. And then review periods. So those things are usually fleshed out when you sign the contract or like during contract negotiations. Usually there's a minimum guarantee in these contracts. So usually contracts last years. A couple years is usually a standard. Usually you say you pay upfront for the license up to a certain amount, and then you have a royalty guarantee that says, out of 10 years, we're going to pay you $10,000 in royalties. And if we don't pay you $10,000 in royalties by the end of those years, I owe that difference, or the person who paid for that license owes that difference. So it's a guaranteed for that publisher or for that IP holder that they're getting some money out of it. And then in addition, it's always good to include free copies for the publisher, whether it's like 5 or 10 copies of everything you produce. And then obviously review cycles and stuff like that, and making sure you have a good sign-off way for you to show off stuff to them. How long that review period will be, because you don't want them to hold up on review period stuff. Right. So one thing I had working with Monty Cook Games once was that, like, it took... sometimes they take a long time to review stuff, but in the contract that they put out, it says, if we haven't responded in 2 weeks, consider it approved. Right. But obviously there's final approval, so if they really come back to it, they could get you on it, but for most part, you're covered. So that's, like, the acquiring the IP part. Now, working on the IP. What interesting or unexpected aspects do you find working on IP? Is it... let's just talk about stories. Like, is there something interesting from working on an IP standpoint that you've never considered or never expected, or something interesting that came out of an IP interaction that... There's a lot of stuff that can happen here. So I'm gonna leave this pretty freeform in terms of either sharing stories or going around to talk about our experiences working in IP or with IPs.
I'll add really quickly because you were talking about contract law. If you're going to be a freelance game designer, get a really good lawyer who knows contract law. And especially if you're doing IP stuff, because good contracts make good friends or good business partners.
Yes. Oh.
The more things are defined, just like everything, the happier everyone will be, because it can become just like, oh well, I thought you assumed this, and the other person's like, no, I assumed this, and it could be completely honest and everything, and then people get hurt feelings, and then things become contentious.
Contracts can save friendships
so much.
There is a
Absolutely.
great GDC series, game developers conference, mostly for video games, but there's a guy that did a couple game law, essentially, like
Right.
He did like a 101 and a 102. I think it's just legal stuff, and he kind of goes over a lot of this stuff. I actually hired him to be my lawyer and make a couple of my contracts before he got hired by another corporation. And he's like,
Right.
sorry, I got to hand you off. But he did like the Baby Bestiary trademarks and stuff for me, and did most
Right.
of my my writer contracts and IP acquisition contracts. So
Yeah, I work a lot with Alan Barr of Gallant Knight Games.
Oh yeah.
And we are, still friends because of our very good contracts that we have with each other, because we're very clear about what's required for different things, right?
And who owns what, and what happens if you want to leave. How much do you own of it, especially for partnerships?
Yeah, it's so important, and especially with like IPs, because I know
As I say, did you work on Zorro?
I did not work on Zorro. They have been working on Zorro. I've heard about, and well, that's the thing. It's like I was in the middle of like my game 90 Nights while they were working on Zorro. So like they literally just got Zorro from the printer, and then like the next day they got from the same printer all my 90 Nights stuff. Wait, sorry, Knights of the Underbed, which was, there you go. There's a question about IP, because there was a children's book from 2015 that no one had heard about until
That owned that title?
Yep. Yeah. Anyways, they had, plenty of experiences with Zorro as far as like approval time periods, right? Like waiting on them to get back, stuff for approval. And I can't really speak about it directly because I wasn't involved directly or anything. But I mean, yeah, that sort of stuff is really important. I mean, I know that when I worked with 7C, and it came back to John Wick, who created it, right? But like it had been owned by Alderac AEG for like years and whatnot. But like when we brought all that stuff in, there was some very clear stuff about like who owns this art and whatnot. And then like getting original art, because it was all from the 90s, so it wasn't like anything digital. It was all like
scanned ink.
Scanned, yeah. Like this is a hard drive from 1995 that has
still takes
30
floppies.
DPI images, and just and like how does that work? And then
So did you guys actually end up remastering some of the art, or like redoing the art as a
most
template?
of the art that we put in the new game is all brand new.
Oh, okay.
Because a lot of it was not usable. They use some like stuff as like guidelines or just ideas and stuff like that. But
the posing and the figure, or like the figure, but like the
and well, like just like
environmental.
inspiration sort of type things, right? Because all Errol Flynn heroic stuff, right? Like the guiding watchword for that was what would Errol Flynn do, for that, because pirate role-playing game.
Pirate.
Could you use his likeness or anything? Or
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just
That's another contract thing, right? Like,
right.
Who owns the likeness? Who owns the?
I
Like-
can't
Yeah,
imagine.
although
especially-
interestingly enough, in the original first edition 7C, all the interior color art for all the nations, there was like full page spreads. They had like 2 or 3 people who were like famous NPCs for each nation. The original artist did amazing art, but it is very clear that she used famous actors and actresses of that time period of the 90s to like as her character figures. So
hey, that's Bill Clinton.
what's his name? Who was in the movie with the bear attack, and he was in Great Gatsby, and who's that actor? He won that Emmy for being in the movie where he gets attacked by a bear. And he did The Beach and all these other movies. And
Don't
oh my
worry,
gosh,
it's not
but
going to come to you until like 3 months.
Exactly.
Leo, someone in chat.
He's like
Leo DiCaprio.
He's like the king of Leonardo DiCaprio. He's the
Thank you,
king
chat.
of
Chat knows all.
of Castile, right? Like that's literally him. And David Duchovny is the cardinal. And it's just like, oh my gosh, these are really obvious. Like Uma Thurman is this woman from Usura, the Russian setting. But yeah, so it was the 90s when
It was
no
the
one in
90s.
Hollywood cared about role-playing games.
That was a weird, yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
back before the internet existed. It was
Marty, what about you? Oh, sorry, Ben.
no, go ahead. I just talked 10 minutes or whatever.
Grab a drink of water. You earned it.
As far as like interesting stuff with IP, working with IP holders, or
Yeah, so either your experiences, like interesting experiences working with IP holders, designing IP, and then either like feedback that happened or came back, or any other interesting aspects of like, trying to design something. They're like, no, we don't like that. We want this instead,
Yeah. So it's really interesting because different IP holders act very differently. And so you never know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've run into cases where, the IP holder or the licensor doesn't really understand the medium that IP is being translated into. And that seems to go one of two ways. It's either the IP holder is like, I don't know what this is. I trust you with everything, just do what you do. And I believe in you to do what you do best. Or it's like, I don't understand it and I'm going to put requirements on it that kind of constrain you or kind of challenge you in different ways. And so it's kind of one of two ways I've found in my experience.
That almost reminds me of how the Witcher series was when the CD Projekt Red first acquired the rights. He's like, I don't believe in the studio. They're not going to make anything that's going to make a lot of money.
Right.
And then, Witcher 3 comes out and it's like, oh, damn, I missed out on a lot of money. Because he asked for the money up front, like all royalty payments and nothing else, because he didn't believe that the game was going to...
I think he wanted it was like $40,000 or something.
Yeah, that was,
super
recently.
small.
He asked
Well,
for
no,
like
I'm saying originally, the original amount, right? And then they kind of came back
I think it was
the
like
table
$4,000,
together.
I think.
Yeah, it was
like
something
40,000,
really low, like
Polish or whatever.
Yeah.
And then like recently he like wanted to sue him for $3 million or $4 million.
Yeah.
And then they settled on something.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was actually probably a good idea on both sides to like come back to the table. And
oh yeah.
Because holy crap.
Yeah, gosh. So Mari, for your experiences, for like someone who hasn't known the medium or had expectations, have you designed something and gave it to them? They're like, what's this? Like, I don't get it, or?
Most of the time. So most of the time I'm
And you don't have to name names.
Right. So most of the time I'm working, like I said, through clients or through an employer, in which case the client or the employer is the one who is interfacing directly with the IP holder or the licensor. And so usually it's, hey,
Oh, your manager comes back and is like, we've got this situation.
Exactly. Or, they're like, yeah, this is fine. I'm not going to touch this. It seems to be one of two ways.
Oh, gosh. Yeah,
well,
so go ahead, Ben.
I was gonna say, like, there's like times where, like, I think on Dune, we're both working on that, and like, there have been a couple times where we've, like, the writers and our developer have been like, oh, maybe we should anticipate maybe a problem here, and then they're like, no, it's cool, right? But like, we've been like, okay, holding our breath, waiting to see.
Like,
if,
something's gonna drop.
Right, or we think that there's something gonna drop, and they're just like, no, it's fine, and then we're like, oh, okay, but like. Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah, no,
So-
for Drifter, in my own experience, one of the things that happened was, so I get to meet with Alex, the creator, obviously not right now because I get to talk to him over the phone. But like, I meet with him, I go through the Drifter, and he kind of like, go through the mechanics, and he goes, oh, that's an interesting way of doing it. Because he's like familiar with D&D, but like hasn't played enough of it to like know D&D.
Right.
Like, kind of like, people who've watched video games versus people who play them. And so he goes like, oh, that's an interesting way of doing it. And then he points out something else and goes, I might be concerned about that. And it's like, oh, I see what you're thinking on that. I'll have to get back to you.
Right.
Because like, for us, well, I can talk about this one because this is actually an interesting design challenge I'm going over right now. Is the Drifter is a blue human, or a blue-skinned human in a world of anthropomorphic creatures, and in the game, the blue humans are not trusted, or like one even gets beaten up and is called the Drunk, and so there's a interesting dynamic in where there's sort of prejudice against the blue human, which could sort of be a translation to, you know, American racism. And so it's like, okay, so I don't want to call them blues because that's a little too close. And that was what he called out. And so I was like, I see where you're going with this. I will get back and research and talk to some people and see what we can do to design around that, because, you know, obviously putting it into words is very different than having, like, you know, a story that people are reading out of.
Right. Yeah.
Gameplay.
I mean, just the translation of the media, like, from one to another.
Oh yeah.
You know.
One interesting question from, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, Katho Maisley, talks about working on an IP with an existing fan base. Have you talked to, or like worked with, or talked to fans to try and get like your pulse of what the fan base assumes or knows about said IP or understanding of IP?
I know that, like, when I worked on I'm gonna go back to 7C. It was from a Kickstarter, but we were still kind of like, when you're a developer, like, there's different levels of developer too. Like, I helped develop the Pirate Nations book, which was one of the first supplements for the game. So I had writers that I was like kind of, I don't want to say mother hen, but like I was screening them from my bosses, and then, you know, and the bosses were dealing with like the public as far as that, because it was a Kickstarter and there was thousands of backers who all had questions and things like that.
Oh,
and I know that 7C initially, some of the stuff that they did was like put out PDFs of like the rough drafts, which is something that like Pathfinder has done and whatnot. And Fantasy Flight Games, I think, also did that for some of their Star Wars games, where they put out like betas basically, and had fan, you know, input and stuff. I don't think we were very definitely not doing that with Dune, because Brian Herbert's still alive and the estate is still, you know, it's a thing, and so they're the ones we're answering to, as far as that goes.
Interesting.
And I'm trying to think of like Warhammer 40K for like Wrath and Glory. I was definitely not involved with any of that stuff on that side. I was there. It was like here is the thing you were working on. Stay in a, you know, dark cave.
You stay in a dark cave.
And that's actually probably not fair. My boss was very nice and was great about.
So for Warhammer, did they provide you?
Actually, did talk with the other developers and stuff too, but.
Well, for Dune and Warhammer, did they provide you with some sort of like, not like the lore book, of like, here is what you need to know about the game, the world, the stuff that hasn't been public NDA? And obviously, I know for Drifter, I had this where it's like, all right, what really happens? You know, and you kind of get the whole, you know, you get the NDA story. And from that, you're like, okay, so now I have to work within this framework and make sure it works with what the public perceives that framework to be. Right.
With 40K, it was very much, I mean, 40K is kind of an open book. They don't have like a lot of secrets.
Books.
They do. So it was like, let's go look at the Lexicanum, which is a website that someone has. It's a Wikipedia that is like the size of Wikipedia.
Oh God. Is it like an internal source, or is it like the
No,
public,
it's a public,
this is the...
public thing that's online. That's like everything you ever wanted to know about 40K at any point, everywhere, and it's exhaustive. And so exhaustive. That, I mean, and Games Workshop also did have like very specific, like, this is how we write, you know, this is how we approach things. So like using British English versus American English for the writing. So, you know, having to take
armor, not armor.
What?
It's armor, not armor.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, literally, you have to go into your Word and like change everything to, you know,
British English.
You can, yeah, so that it doesn't like correct stuff and make sure, you know, that all works in those sort of ways. But like, I didn't have anything secret. I know when we were working on 7C, there was some like discussion about keeping things like in hidden, sort of like secret stuff, and then like maybe giving that to the GMs, because that's how first edition worked, where they had like player facing knowledge and then game master knowledge, and the decision was made eventually to be like, nope, everything's going to be out there so that players and game masters can decide for themselves, right? But then we did write specific things where like in some of this stuff to make it like a mystery, but the mystery was up for the game masters to decide, not for us to like make a decision on. So
you sort of like crafted narratives, and then like you knew what happened, but you made it a cliffhanger,
right?
So that
and,
they
like,
could go either direction with it.
Right, exactly. Like here, it's like, who is this guy who's doing like in the Pirate Nations, there's this whole question of like the Cerneth and who they were and who they came from before, or where they came from and what happened to them. And so I had this guy that I created as an NPC in the setting that is like, he knows the answer, and it's one of these three things, and then the game master gets to decide kind of like what that answer is.
Cool.
So for their players, because whatever works with your game at home, right? Like, if I'm working and I decide to write a specific answer to something, that may not always work for your game at home. So it's easier to just kind of leave it open for them, as opposed to them having to do a big rewrite, and then players being like, well, I thought it was this, and then you have arguments at the table.
Yeah.
So
for both of you, is there something where you've worked, like, so when you get like the lore, like you understand, like, the court, like the books talk about this set of stories and touch these areas, sort of like, I guess Dune does that in a sense, because there's only what, 3 books? Well, I don't know how many books there are to Dune.
There are so many.
Oh, so it's like the Wheel of Time kind of thing, where it's like, how many books are there?
Well, so Frank Herbert wrote 3, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Right? And then
I think he wrote
and then Brian
7.
Oh, 7? He wrote 7. Yeah. Okay.
He wrote the original. Well, so he wrote the original trilogy, and then his first publisher came back to him and said, "We have crazy amounts of money to offer you to write more," and so he wrote several more. He wrote to Chapter House Dune was his last book.
Right, and then Brian Herbert has been writing them since.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So
interesting.
There are a lot of novels.
And there's and Brian's written like 12 or more.
It's a lot more books than I expected.
Yeah. So like Frank wrote 6, it looks like. I just looked it up just to be sure, because when we first started this project, I went back and read like all of it again.
Oh wow!
I know, right?
Audiobook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did actually a lot of audiobook. And so he wrote the original trilogy, which was Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune. And then he came back and he wrote another trilogy, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. And then Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson wrote a whole bunch. There's like 12, I think, or something. There's multiple trilogies that are like prequels and sequels. The first group was a prequel series that set like with the previous generation. So like Duke Leto Atreides and stuff like that.
So for something like that, and Mari, you worked on Dishonored as well, right?
Yes, I worked on Dishonored and Homeworld and Dune, all with Modiphius.
Oh, nice. So for stuff like where you have like an IP set in more stories, there's a lot of unanswered questions in the periphery, So for like Dishonored, there's, who is I would say the mysterious man.
Right.
Or like, is he like, just an agent of chaos? Is he a supernatural being? Is he, what role does that have in the world? What do rats have to do with it? How much prevalence is magic in the setting? The Outsider, thank you. My brain was... The mysterious stranger is something that one of my old friends used. I think it's a Star Wars reference.
Yeah,
I knew who you were talking about.
Yeah. And so when you're free to create in the bounds of the setting, but you don't have reference material like directly, so like, you have the storyline of the, God, my brain is blinking, Man with the Mask, Corvo. you have his story, and then you have his daughter's story from Dishonored 2, or his Corvo's continued story. But that's it. Like, you know, you go to 2 places in that world.
Well, I think they had comics and books and stuff as well.
They did have a couple comics. I think they were
Yeah.
fleshed out by Dark Horse? Maybe.
I think so.
Question mark?
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing with like Mass Effect too. Like, you know, you have this massive world and a ton of stories. When you're creating in those worlds, when you reference like the game material, in this case it's game material, how do you, when you build forward, what kind of things are you thinking about? What kind of things are you working with? Are you trying to be inspired by the medium to continue telling stories? Are you looking for opportunities when you replay the game Dishonored? Like, oh, what's this about? You know, like, oh, they talk about this plague, you know, where it came from, but nowhere else in the lore does it talk about this plague or where it came from. Kind of like in Dark Souls, where, like, you know, we talk about 5 other countries, but we never touch them, except for having this one Onion Knight.
Right. So in Dishonored specifically, I guess it would sort of tie into like doing the story hooks and things like that for the GMs. And so it's, you know, you kind of go through and you're looking at this world and these really cool stories, and where are the things that you're curious about or that you have questions about, and then you kind of create story hooks around that, or like the different lands that you don't necessarily get to explore as much, or that have, because there are a lot of they did a great job with distant mountains, you know, like, oh, hey, there's this place and they do this thing. Mm-hmm. And they don't really go into
this one thing, and we don't talk.
Yeah, or they have this one delicacy, or, you know, things like that. And so those are the fun things to kind of, oh, well, maybe you can center an adventure around this, or go here and learn more about that, or things like that. So I think it's really fun to find the things that aren't defined and kind of poke at them a little bit.
Yeah. And do you find that, like, when you pick, so usually like that kind of stuff isn't really like in scope, because it's like, we're building out the setting, you know, and that it covers a lot more than what they gave you, so like you sort of have a broad brush to work with, but at the same time, like, for like myself, I know I'm like always haunted by the vision of the game, or for like, because, you know, Hyper Light Drifter is, you know, specifically a game medium. Same with Dishonored was a hard game medium as well. For something as aesthetic as Dishonored was, especially with, like, you know, the oil tech, the whale
punk.
Brews, whale punk.
Yeah, whale punk.
Yes, whale punk makes, God, rip the whales. There's a lot of whales to make this world possible.
Oh yeah.
They must reproduce like rabbits. But like being able to, what sort of like limitations have you like run up against ever? Where like you'll try to poke at something and they're like, oh no, we got plans for that. Like, or no, you can't talk about like the king's daughter.
Right.
You know. Right.
Well, a lot of times what I didn't really run into too many instances of that where they said don't go there or don't do that, I think. Oftentimes what I did was I would create a character that's, say, like a professor in one of the universities, and would kind of flesh that out and make everything very character-centric. And so maybe this character is going after an artifact or trying to research something, or, you know, or going after like myths or things like that that are in the world and that were maybe touched upon in, you know, the different games or media.
So I haven't fully pawed through Dishonored yet. I am waiting for the book to come in to paw through it myself, because I really enjoyed the games. And I actually haven't finished the second one yet. I'm still playing through it. But speaking of the person at the university, because I just passed that mission a little while ago, that is, so for regions outside, you sort of develop a character in a university and sort of leave that agnostic to the rest of the, like, the city. So you have, like, fantasy city named this. I'm not sure if they give you the name, but then, you know, either you provided a name and you say, okay, there's a university here, and we have a professor that's here. And then just kind of leave everything else around that agnostic.
Yes, and because they've created this wonderful, rich world already. And so if you create a character that has a goal and a motivation, then, you know, your GMs and your players can kind of rip off of that and just run with it, right?
That's all they really need to run with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what it all boils down to is just doing tons and tons of research and just immersing yourself in the fandom and the genre.
Right.
Yep.
That is 100% what it is all. Yeah, it is like 99% research, like knowing the material. The better you know the material, the better you can do a job of, like, you know, creating stuff.
Have you ever found, this could be to both of you as well, when you dive into the lore, the setting, when you dive into the game that much, do you sometimes find that you almost know it? Like, when you start becoming aware of what fans know it as versus what you know it at, what you've become to know it as.
Yeah.
Because I've noticed that a little bit with myself with Drifter, in the sense that, like, I know what the fans see in the game, and I know what the creator sees in the game, and I need to somehow bridge that gap. So for Drifter is specifically unique because it is a non-verbal game. There's a lot of environmental storytelling in it, and so you learn by only seeing. So it's very much like a silent movie, except that you're playing it, and therefore you put yourself in the character's shoes a bit more. And with that, players come up with their own lexicon of what's happening in the world. Why is the Drifter sick? And I need to put that into writing, into some way that agrees with their own internal lexicon of what the setting is and what it means. And I know I've run up against a wall sometimes, not talking to the IP holder, but when I look at discussing with fans what they see in the world and how to make sure what I put in the game agrees with what they see in that world. I'm not sure if you guys have dealt with that at all. Or at least, like, being familiar enough with the source material where you think that the fans might view it as something else or something not as what you envisioned it.
Do you have a thing, Mary?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing.
Okay. Like, I mean, I know when I was working on Dune, one of the things I worked on some of the, like, the military combat stuff, and Dune was written originally in the 70s and 80s, and Frank was brilliant about, like, ecological, like, you know, well, ecology, like, just in the environment and all those things. Like, what he was writing about is, you know, literally decades ahead of, like, what anyone else was even thinking about or doing at the time.
I wonder if it's like akin to Tom Clancy. My brain's thinking to parallels now. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, but, like, he's definitely not a military guy. Like, so there's a technology in the Dune setting which is like shields, like personal shields that people can wear, and shields and lasers don't interact well. They cause nuclear explosions, which is all cool and stuff. But, like, the tactics that they set up for the entire universe to use as far as, like, combat with shields, like, it's not like what a lot of people would consider, like, really good tactics, because it's all this, like, one man on man with a dagger sort of thing versus,
yeah, it's all hand-to-hand combat, right?
Right, yeah. And I mean, and that works great for, like, writing a novel where, you know, to, like, increase tension and stuff like that. But if you think about it at any sort of, like, scale, where if you have, like, 1,000 guys running at 1,000 guys with shields, like, what would really work on that, you know, like, on, like, a strategic level or any of those things?
Why
is, like,
is this modern military, you know, theory?
Using daggers, right? Like, why are they not using pikes? You know, or yeah, exactly. So it's like, when we write about this sort of stuff, like here's this, like, you know, space, and, like, a lot of, you know, like, there have been plenty of people who have, like, talked about that on, like, forums and whatnot, and so it's like, well, we have to, you know, you want to keep the feeling of the setting as well, and you want to be true to that, you know, without also, like, compromising it, or I don't know how to, like, put this in clear words, to, like, let the, you know, so, like, have the setting be true to itself and what it is, and keep the internal setting logic going, right? Without also, like pissing off your players by, so you want to make, and if there's contradictions in the setting, you want to make it so that it's clearly for a good reason for the story and stuff like that, so that people can be like, oh, okay, all right, dragons can fly even though they're 10,000 ton beasts with tiny bat wings.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, I'm expecting to see a line in Dune saying there are only hand-to-hand combats to deal with disputes by their chosen champions, or something like Game of Thrones. We don't need battles. We've decided to do it with one individual.
Well, you'll see when it comes out. So.
Ooh, I might be onto something. Players may only engage in hand-to-hand combat. Got it.
Right. I mean, and the thing is like when you're playing the role-playing game, you're literally sitting around a table with like 4 to 6 friends, and so that even is still on like a similar level of storytelling as you would in a novel. So it's not going to be like 10,000 troops, invading a new planet or something like that. So, and Dune itself, like Arrakis, the planet, is very unique in the sense that like sandworms are enraged by shields, and because of the sand and the weather and the environment, like shields don't work very well on that planet. So that sort of thing isn't common. So it was like all the empires like knowledge, all their strategic and wisdom that they had like accumulated did not work on Dune. So the Fremen who had lived there for generations had a big step up. And that's actually part of like the narrative of like why these things worked and didn't work.
So for that specifically, like, I know you guys can't speak directly to it because it's not out yet.
Although I think you can sign up for the beta now.
Yeah.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah.
Post a link in chat now, but speaking of which, for something like Dune, where there is a narrative aspect that doesn't translate to games, obviously that's never a fun thing to work on, because you're like, how do I make this darn thing work, or how do I compromise the setting or the system to, the one thing has to give, right? Either, you're holding true to the story. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So either like, you need to hold the setting to work with the mechanics, or the mechanics to work with the setting. How, at least for Dune, how has that been working out in terms of like trying to rectify certain mechanics? Does it go to a higher board? Is there like a master designer that calls the shots on those after you have discussions and do design, or
I mean,
or for any project?
I mean, like a lot of the system is very narrative based for Dune. Would you agree? Like, it's not like tactical miniatures or anything like that. And so it's like that. So you can get around a lot of that sort of, you don't have to worry about like taking 5-foot steps or attacks of opportunity in this game, because it is a narrative game. I mean, which I think is really the correct answer for how do you tell Dune, stories, because the whole thing is very much like sweeping arcs and grand, empires rising and falling type stuff. And it is all very character focused, including characters that are like the desert and the planet and the worm.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
So they would almost exist as participants in a narrative as... Interesting.
Right, like...
Yeah, Arrakis, the planet, is very much a character in the book.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. So, yeah, and donkeys. But so many donkeys, and I don't know why. No, but
knowing nothing about Dune, I am very confused.
But the whole so like the game design system I think lended itself very well to like not papering over, but like being able to sidestep any of those problems like that, right? But you also like in the writing, you need to acknowledge like, oh well, here's this thing or that. But like mechanically, you're able to like not sidestep, but like you're able to, be able to just narratively describe what's going on with that, versus like, oh well, I don't have this feat, or my character doesn't have this, special ability. Because when you're creating the character, you're doing it in almost a narrative way, because there are certain places where you're like making statements about who your character is. I wouldn't call them aspects, but they're like
kind of like fate invokes.
I am like way low on sleep right now. It's not like fate invokes, but it's like what is it, Mary? I'm trying to because I've run the game.
Ben had a very rough night last night, just for heads up on everyone. I
was up all night, my dog at the emergency vet, and he's totally fine now. But like
thank goodness. Yay.
Yeah, thank goodness. Oh my gosh, he jumped off our couch and hurt his back, and pulled a muscle, and so he was like crying, and it was a nightmare. But so I was literally sitting in an emergency vet like all night. I got home at 7 a.m. And I left the house at like 2:30. But because they wanted to make sure it wasn't like a degenerative bone disorder and stuff like that.
So you didn't sleep at all. You didn't take a nap or anything.
No, I have not.
You're like, why go to sleep? It's already morning.
Exactly.
Oh god.
So like so there are statements in your character that you make about your character that help define who they are, that are able to very easily and I would say cleanly and elegantly deal with those sort of problems. So
to be fair, I didn't work on the mechanics part. I was more the lore and that sort of thing.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Interesting, because I assume Dune would be a very interesting property to work on as well. Just saying.
Yeah. That's fair.
For Dune,
slightly different, but
slightly less hell.
Yeah.
A little less hell involved. For Dune, for the narrative aspect, I guess they're telling you to build out planets and stuff like that, right? In the system that of referenced, or even I'm not sure how Dune is set up as a world or universe.
It's definitely a universe. Very vast.
So with that, I actually have a question for you about Dishonored. What did you work on for Dishonored?
Let's see. I did more lore on that one. I didn't really work on the mechanics. Yeah. So some of the characters, I described some of the characters, some of the story hooks, things like that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Let me just pop through chat for a second. Hello, mouse. There we go. So, Ethan, you had a question about specific instances of how rights are assigned and retained. So this is very much into the contract that you create. Very much into the contract. Obviously, as employees, you don't retain work pretty much to anything you create, or as contractors. But for like a publisher like myself, typically rights are shared. So they're either shared or owned. So the weird part is you could have it where you own the game, but they own all the terms. So like, even if I lose the right to publish the game, I would have to change out all the things that are owned by them, like Hyper Light Drifter. Like there would be all these terms and words that you'd have to swap out to make it something else. And at which point you might as well just start over and use like the mechanical system, underlying system for something else. So typically what happens is when you own the IP or in a contract, you own the right to the text that you created with the specific instances of text being owned by them. That said, the contract allows you to sell that product. So once that contract expires or doesn't renew, you're still not allowed to sell that product. So even though you own the body of work and the art, the art you might be able to reuse depending on your ownership contract with them and your negotiation with that license holder. So potentially all this pixel art I make for Hyper Light Drifter, I could use on another product, considering if Heart Machine allows me to use it on something else. And so that really becomes, because what we did for ours is our art ownership is by partnership. So we both own the rights to it, which means we both have to decide together how it's used, if used outside of the core products. And that sets it up so there's no way that either party is abusing it. I mean, in the end of the day, like, we're both trying to do the best for the game and the brand, because, you know, I'm working on the brand, I'm creating a product to promote the brand, but really what happens then is, you know, it's in service to the brand at the end of the day, and if anyone was trying to, aka, screw you out of it, that's what the contract's there to protect you and them from abuses. As to Pixel Carpenter's question about numbers that fly around on the cost payment side, honestly, it's everywhere. I have seen things as low... I mean, The Witcher was bought for $4,000 when it started. I have seen anything from $1,000 to probably $10,000, depending on the IP.
Millions, if you're talking about Star Wars.
Oh, I don't even want to know how much FFG paid for that. Oh my god.
Stupid money. I know that, like...
Paid off, though.
I had some... Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's Star Wars, right? So if you get something like that, then you're paying tons up front, but then you're also making tons of money. I had some friends who... I in a previous life, I had some friends who worked with Star Wars, making those really fancy lightsabers that people liked, and master replicas. And they paid a lot of money just up front to be able to do it, and then they made a lot of money because those lightsabers were in like every store everywhere, right? Because, you know, everyone wanted a really cool lightsaber.
Those are the fiberglass ones?
The ones that like lit up.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and that's the early 2000s when they first came out. I don't think they... And then, like, master replicas, like, ownership changed, and so Star Wars removed it. But then, like, the engineer who designed the actual lightsabers, like, created his own company and then got the rights to it again. So, yeah, IP is very interesting. But, like, yeah, you're right. It's everything from, like, you know, here, let's share profits on this, to, like, millions of dollars.
Right.
And speaking of contracts as well, there are some provisions in contracts that don't allow the movement of a contract to another company.
Right, exactly.
Again, these are all things in terms. Usually that's like usually that's in under transferable rights, to say like, oh, if I cannot deliver this product or project, I can transfer the right or the license to another individual. Sometimes that requires the IP holder's permission to do so, or explicit written approval, as they would say.
Right.
Question: how do you balance the fidelity of IP with encouraging creativity and improvisation among the users, GMs, and players? That sounds like a Mari question for setting.
Ooh, put on the spot here.
I know, sorry. Got to make sure everyone gets their fire, right?
Yeah. I think that... Oh, so I kind of meant to mention also, because someone asked about like what I worked on Dishonored, and so I kind of mentioned characters and lore and story hooks, and I also worked on some of the locations as well, like describing them, things like that. So as far as this question, what was this question again?
It was about balancing IP and balancing the fidelity of the IP with encouraging creativity and improvisation. Kind of like you have the framework of the setting, and how do you make it vague enough but still the setting?
Right. So I think that comes down to, again, making it very character-centric. So creating a character that lives in a certain part of that world, and then sort of creating a hook around that character and what they want, and making sure that it is appropriate for that universe and the motivation makes sense within that universe as well.
What about creating locations?
Creating locations?
Yeah.
I didn't actually create locations for Dishonored.
Or just in general. Sorry.
In general.
Or anything else that you've worked on too. Yeah.
Okay. So creating locations, yeah, it's got to, again, fit within sort of the rules of that universe. So if you're creating like a place for smugglers, or you're creating, you know, a bay for pirates, or, you know, these sort of things, it has to make sense within that world, and it's ideal for there to be some sort of framework for that there already.
Cool.
But yeah, lots of research, lots of research, and I find that tone helps too. So like with Dishonored, or I've worked on Malifaux as well. I mean, you know, choosing your words really makes a difference. So, I mean, those take place in, an alternate late 1800s or early 1900s, right? And so they're not going to say like groovy, for example. So like just making sure that your tone and the word choice and everything is appropriate for that setting really helps. I think it goes a long way.
Would you admit you have spent more time thinking about word choice sometimes than actually like writing a thing out?
Oh, I mean, yeah, definitely. Oh my gosh. And there's so much research behind it too. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, did this word, was it used then? Was this phrase used then? Like, what's the history behind it? Like
etymology.com.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm a big fan of Google Ngrams.
Yeah.
They have like all of their digital books, and you can kind of do a big search and it'll tell you, oh yeah, this word or phrase was used at this time, and it peaked in popularity at this time, and it's really, really helpful. It's fantastic. I love that tool.
I literally
I'm gonna try that because I've been like trying to like for Drifter like looking at thesaurus and like trying to think of different words for like mechanics items and stuff like that, and I'm like, it's not. I'm clicking around and not finding the words I need.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I literally was just looking up. I mean, this was yesterday. I was looking up the word Philistine and how it's used in like conversation. A lot of people are like, if you're like familiar with like,
sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, totally.
The follow-up question.
Bob had no appreciation for like classical music. He was such a Philistine. And it's like anyone who's like read like the Bible or the Torah or anything like that will recognize the term Philistine as in the tribe of people that Goliath came from, that David fought with his sling and he killed Goliath, who was the champion of the Philistines. But really, the term comes from it's from that story. But what it was like in Germany in the 16 or 1700s, there was like these two groups of people in this like major city that got in a huge like city fight, like almost a mini civil war. And one of the sides, they called them the Philistines because they did not appreciate arts and culture. And that is where the modern usage comes from. So
that
it was
is
like
so bizarre.
right? I was like, that is amazing, weird story. And like, so you get these like, where these things come from like that. NEO 86 made some comment about like source material, like trying to make it work with the game mechanics, which kind of with Mary was saying, like I worked on one of the very first games I put out was World of Do, which is like a samurai noir role-playing game. And Ghost of Tsushima is a video game that's out right now that has very many like similar themes where you're playing like a samurai, and it's all like Akira Kurosawa, like very much inspired. Like that's like my World of Do is my like love letter to Akira Kurosawa movies. And like in Ghost of Tsushima, like duels are very simple in that you're holding a button down, and as soon as you think the time is right to attack a guy in a standoff, you just let go and the attack happens in like a split second and everything kind of slows down. And with the game mechanics that we created for World of Do, like that was like one of the big things was that sort of type of fight should really be this like focal moment, but like also like really simple and fast and deadly. So the game was using like, you had like pools of D6s, so you could have like, like 20 D6s in a duel to face off a guy. So he would just obliterate them, right? Because
that's dramatic.
Like, right, exactly. It's an Akira Kurosawa film, right?
Yeah.
So you consider like the themes of like the stories you're trying to tell, and you were saying, what was the word you used earlier, which was like the perfect word?
Was it say Philistine? No.
It did actually go back to like word choice,
tone
like
and mood, or
tone and mood. Yeah, tone and mood. Like those are all very important things. So like I when I first started working on something like that, I would like make huge lists of like what I think the themes are and the tones and the moods and how all that works together to tell these stories. Like wind is such a big important thing in Kurosawa films, and so you have like something to do with that,
especially
and like
the silence, hearing the wind,
right, long pauses and like just wind blowing in the background, and so you think about all these different things, and you would try to include mechanics that specifically highlight those things. And when I do game design, I'm an additive game designer. and people have all different styles, but I just like throw everything in, and then I start cutting stuff out.
Interesting.
To like try to like narrow it down and like distill it to something that I really like once I get to that point. Because if it's something that's like, this is great, but it's like too much, right? Like I really like the new Star Wars FFG stuff, but I feel like, and also FFG's L5R new game system, a lot of it I like, but I also feel like at some point there's like 10 extra rules that I don't need for certain things. And so,
Grapple?
But I'm also one of those like minimalist game designers too. So
it's a popular trend nowadays.
So that whole thing of like putting in and making sure you're covering all your themes while also like not putting too much in it. So like if you're going to do a game mechanic, like what's the most important thing about like like Hyperlife Drifter? Like what is one of your like central core themes of the game, and how does that come through mechanically? Like those are like important questions I ask myself as a game designer.
Oh yeah, like for Drifter, one of the things that it's funny because I actually was designing it as a Cypher hack almost.
Right.
I was gonna hack Cypher to like it would not be recognizable Cypher anymore, and because Monty Cook was just they were super busy with a whole lot of other stuff. Like, they're a small team, they're super busy.
Right.
Because they didn't respond back like in time or after like a couple months. I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna do my own thing. Like I was gonna, because when I was earlier talking to them about a different IP project I was working on, or like my own IP project. And when I showed them the number of changes I was gonna make, they were like, this might be a bit too many changes from like Cypher Core. Like you might need to do something different with this. And so that kind of was like a calling point for me. Like, oh, I might as well just like, do my own system for Drifter. And at that point, like I might, because originally like the plan was like, oh, maybe I'll do like a Cypher version and a D&D 5e compatible version. And I'm sort of glad I didn't do that because God, that'd have been a ton of work. Like system support, as cool as it is, it takes a lot of time and money to work out.
Oh yeah.
And
so much testing.
Oh, that too. Oh my God. So Drifter really came out to be what my reimagining. It sort of started as a hack in the sense of I wanted to solve a bunch of problems I had with Cypher, and then continue just building it for Drifter. So part of that was a single energy pool and separate hit points. Because how Cypher Numenera system worked is, you have 3 pools. They're your energy pool and your health at the same time. And when you use it, it goes to the next level. So you use your intellect, like, it was very weird because like you'd use your intellect, then your speed, and then your might, in terms of like going unconscious. And I wasn't a big fan of that, or I found it interesting, but I didn't find it intuitive enough. And so for Drifter, I separated that completely, where you have your energy pool and you have HP as its own thing. And so for Drifter became like a 4th edition like combat sim in a sense. But then in the second hand, I was trying to do the dice mechanic of how do I make PTBA work for a D20. And so I was sort of balancing those design concepts. So I kind of had 4th edition, PTBA with a D20, and then an energy pool. And that's sort of like my 3 pillars of like mechanics that I was working with. And definitely if you look at it now, like we have an ability system, a tile-based mechanic combat system. We have a hex grid overland crawl. We have a underground procedurally generated, underground exploration. And then we have like, our Pokemon battle map that's, a set grid. And so for us, for me, like I started with just the energy system and a few abilities and health as our core, and the dice mechanic. And that was like what I started with last Gen Con. 1 year ago, I started designing Drifter. And I had 2.5 months to build a prototype for Gen Con.
Wow.
Because when I got the contract, because like we started talking about the contract like 8 months before that. And I had like a schedule figured out, and I was like, okay, well, we need to sign the thing. But then when we signed it, it's like, crap, I've got 2.5 months before Gen Con. And if I want to playtest something, like, I gotta have it. And so that was my struggle with Drifter was, well, getting stuff out to actually playtest. And so we had a very, very rough alpha for Gen Con, which was actually great because I was able to get a lot of feedback from, gamers of every type, and many who never played Hyperlight Drifter. So they weren't biased by what was the game, just, is this fun? So, but I think there was a question. Oh, I guess, I don't know if we want to wrap up. I mean, it's past 3 o'clock, so if you guys want to wrap up, or we can continue to chat and tell stories. One question is, if you could snag a dream IP, what would that
Avatar.
be?
Oh my gosh.
What about you, Mari?
Oh man. There's so many. I mean,
that is also
Oh my
the
gosh.
correct answer.
Top 3.
oh my gosh. Don't make me choose.
Right?
Yeah. Jeez. But I mean, if honestly, I'll become a fan of whatever I work on because it's just so much fun, and you get to dive into this whole new world and sometimes a new genre. So when I was working on romance novel games, I didn't really have much context for it because I wasn't really into the romance novel genre and I hadn't really read it before. And so when I started working on those games, I had to really dive in and see, what does the audience like? What does the audience want? What is this genre?
What do people like about this thing?
Well, I mean, it's like anything. People are nerdy about different things, and there are romance novel nerds out there, and so it was a lot of fun to dive into this, because with Dune and Dishonored, I've been a sci-fi fantasy nerd forever, but I hadn't been a romance novel nerd yet, and so to dive into that was really fun and exciting, and I got to learn about this whole new world and this whole new genre that I hadn't really gotten to know yet. And so, yeah, really a dream IP. You might not know that it's your dream IP until you get it.
That's
potentially
true. That is so true. Yeah, for me, my next IPs that I'd probably want to dive for would be Hollow Knight. That is one I would love to grab and go after. Another would probably be Lord of the Rings would be fun, but I feel like it's been used so many times. But I feel like there's a different story that could be told in that universe. But I'd probably want to say Heroes of Might and Magic. For me, I'm a big video game player, and then Mass Effect. I think that would be really cool. There is so much. They've got a cool world set out, and I think that's ripe for someone to do something really cool with.
Yeah, there was a fan-made Mass Effect thing, and then I think he I'm gonna say I don't know who the person was that created it, but they also were using assets and stuff, and were so it was a little sketchy, but it was
Well, that's always the
that
weird
would
thing
be a
with,
really
fan
cool
projects too, because it's that's a lot of fan artwork, and as cool as it is, it feels weird, especially as a publisher, because we're not allowed to do that.
Right? Yeah, exactly. You have to be very careful. I've never shown anything for the Avatar stuff that I've written in public anywhere. I will show someone who comes over to my house and I'll run a game for them, but I won't do it anywhere in public or online anywhere, because if I want that IP ever, or be even involved with it, I can't be that guy who ripped off their IP 5 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, that's always actually a super awkward point. People who make fan hacks, and it's I see the people who make a Dark Souls 5e thing, and it's that's cool, but I made my own setting that's inspired by it, and I did all the prereq work and made it actually unique and separate, but still inspired and a homage to. But
right.
Look at my thing.
Yeah, because there's always the danger that the IP holder will kind of
or even
bring
the
down
artists
the hammer, right?
whose work they borrow.
Right.
Probably not permission. They might credit them, but it's not like they sometimes get
Right.
explicit permission to do so.
Right. And
Or
I mean,
likenesses, if they're if someone did something with the X-Files and having likenesses involved, I mean, that's a whole nother, IP essentially. And yeah, it can get really, really complicated.
Oh, yeah. Well, awesome. Well, I think we'll be up on time. I will stop my recording. I'll press the record button on this side, too. So, just to finally wrap up, I'm Andreas Walters. I am the founder of Metal Weave Games and the host of this channel. You can find me at Metal Weave Games, or metalweave.games, website metalweave.games, or my Twitter handle is either at metalweavegames or at Andreas_MWG. Mari, who are you? Can they find you?
I'm Mari Tokuda. I'm a freelance writer, and you can find me at maritokuda.com or at maritokuda on Twitter. And say hi. Don't be shy.
And last but not least.
And I'm Ben Woerner. You can find me at Wonderworks on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter or the other things right now because of my day job. But yeah, you can, or actually I'm here on Twitch, although rarely. So I sometimes stream video games I play on my computer, and that's Captain Blood, because Errol Flynn. Yeah, so that's where you can, and you can say hi. If you find me on Facebook, and drop by and say hello as well.
Awesome. And let me just ping these in the chat. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and hanging out. And I hope you guys have a good Gen Con. I've got 2 more panels coming up tomorrow. I believe 10 a.m. Pacific time. No, I think they're earlier than that. I've got 2 panels. I'll post them up later. And one is about doing your layout for your first game, or just doing layout in general. And the other one is kickstarting and crowdfunding. And both of those are tomorrow morning. You can follow me on Twitter or look up Metal Weave Games on the Gen Con list. Yeah, it's early. I know the whole Eastern time has been like, wait, what time am I signing up for this thing that's now Eastern and not the joys. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have yourselves a wonderful afternoon.
All right. Bye, everyone.
I'm going to go sleep.
Yes,
Thanks.
Ben,
yes.
sleep.
Yes.
Sleep.
I'm so glad that your dog is okay.
I know.
Me too. Yeah.